Hey guys, this is a clip from a podcast that I did with Sasha Yanshin. He's a pretty big YouTuber in the finance space and stocks and personal investing. And I asked him about Palantir. Now, he recently just came out with a video about a week before I did this podcast, or the week of I did this podcast with him, about why Palantir will fail. And that video was all of the bear cases. Now, Palantir is one of his largest convictions, but he is not super ultra go to the moon with it because he wants to be a little bit more optimistically conservative. And he has a lot of bear cases for why Palantir doesn't work out. So in this video that you're about to see, or this clip, I basically asked him, hey, why did you invest in Palantir? What was like the ultimate reason you pulled the trigger on making the investment? And then what is sort of your biggest issue with the company? And a lot of it has to deal with how fast they're going to be able to keep up with tech and some of the, problems with the commercial and governmental space. So I hope you guys enjoy. Definitely hope it informs your perspective on Palantir and definitely gives you a little bit more of a bear case. And check out the full podcast with him in the description because we talked about a lot of stuff, especially about inflation and rates and the government. So some good stuff. So this is Sasha Yanshin and his investment philosophy for Palantir.
Speaking of things that challenge the status quo, Palantir, a company that I have a heavy position in, that I'm very interested in, that your audience may be interested in, and my audience. Why did you first initiate your position in Palantir?
Well, I initially was buying relatively early on after they went public, just because I felt the price was relatively good for where the company was headed. It's kind of weird because with Palantir, I have a relatively positive outlook. Probably not the sort of like it's going to the moon, it's going to become the next biggest AI company in the world, is going to like destroy Google, whatever. Like there's a lot of, with every investment that I make, it's kind of frustrating because like I frustrate the bulls, if you like. I hate the term, but the bulls in that space because I am like super pessimistic in their opinion, but I'm also like completely the opposite perspective of what all the bears think about the stock. Right. And I think that the major difference is that I kind of evaluate the risks a little bit more and appreciate the risks. Like I recently made a video about Palantir where I literally spent the entire video highlighting all the actual like serious risks that the company has, because a lot of the time when I see people like have a negative view on a company, the stuff they say, there are negative things about every company, but the stuff they say is often like complete rubbish. And I was like, well, it's annoying that the narrative, even when they invite people on CNBC, say something negative about Tesla, and they just like completely make stuff up or say complete blatant lies or just like completely irrelevant points. I'm like,
grossly overvalued. I just feel it's grossly overvalued.
I can make like a 20-30 minute video just listing you massive problems that Tesla genuinely has as a stock. And they will be genuine problems, and Tesla's my biggest position. And it's one of those where with every stock there's an issue. With Palantir, the reason I started investing is because I felt the value was there and the risks were like good enough for me to put my money into the stock. And despite those risks, it's like with an earlier stage company like that, it is always a bit more difficult, especially with a company which is B2B and where the relative like information available about the actual product is like super restricted. Like 60% of Palantir's revenue comes from US government and US military at the moment. And putting understanding in any real depth what exactly that software looks like, what exactly the competition in the space is nigh on impossible unless you are working for those governments and you get approached and you kind of regularly speak to potential providers of that stuff. So compared to some other companies, it is more difficult to value. So you're kind of valuing top down, you're kind of looking at their metrics and saying, okay, this is how I'm going to project, but you can't really do a very effective bottom-up model. You can't go and say, oh, well, my model says that next quarter they're going to sell to these specific clients. And in my model, I reckon like this client will pay $12 million and that client will pay $25 million. It's very much you partially blind in the data space compared to some of the other companies, but I felt the upside was strong enough in terms of a very unique space. And it's kind of like people don't understand the company, like you say.
Yeah.
But it's also an incredibly simple thing. If you actually like, people kind of say all kinds of weird things, but it's just a place where you aggregate data and kind of analyze it. I mean, that's it. It's like if you work in anything to do with data, it's like you have, you run a website or whatever. You have your Google Analytics data by the website. You have some metrics about some sales you have over there. You have some completely unrelated data that like the problem that most organizations have is they have huge amounts of data, but they can't do anything with it. And all Palantir is doing is basically building a very sophisticated piece of software that makes it incredibly quick and simple and relatively seamless to merge all these pieces of data together, and then allow anybody a sort of a pretty much GUI way of like clicking, point and click with a mouse, of being able to analyze it and do stuff with it. So data that previously was, would take an analyst a few months worth of work to merge and properly clean and do all that kind of stuff to do a one-off piece of ad hoc analysis, they can go and allow companies to analyze and pick up things that would never previously be picked up, like relationships, like for airlines, where they can know based on the data in all the sensors available on a plane, that when the combination of those sensors data begins looking a bit more like this rather than that, that means that this particular part is going to fail at some point in the near future. And so that you don't have to cancel flights, etc., you might as well replace it next time the plane lands. Things like that, which save huge amounts of money, save huge amounts of time, are extremely effective, but like nobody's really done that level of data aggregation analysis before. And I think it has quite a big moat around it, where replicating is not necessarily like a viable business model, because it's one of those where once people are on the platform and they're using it and it does everything and it does it well, it is relatively difficult to then displace.
Right.
Like I can go and create another platform that could theoretically be as good as YouTube tomorrow, but nobody's going to go on it because everyone's on the other platform already. And why would you go to something without there being a really good reason? Right. Yeah, I'm waffling.
No, that makes sense. You did make a video the other day about all of sort of the harsh reasons why Palantir could fail. If you had to isolate one of those as like the biggest risk factor in your mind, which one would that be? I think you mentioned they get their money from the government, the sort of SPAC stuff that could fail.
I think the two biggest reasons. So the biggest short-term reason for me is the concentration in clients, and like it was one reason together that I bundled the concentration in like a small number of high-value clients, plus the lack of evidence so far that they can penetrate the sort of like smaller business through to retail markets.
Right.
Because we haven't seen anything really in that space. There's talk, and they're saying we're getting, but we're still talking about like their contracts in the millions, tens of millions. So we're still talking about large companies here.
Right.
So in the short term, it's probably the biggest risk. Like not necessarily a risk of collapse, but a risk of stagnation. And because the valuation is so heavily based on growth, like any prolonged stagnation for a few quarters, where, for example, like let's say a few big contracts don't go their way or whatever. Somebody cancels, doesn't renew, like that could have a pretty long lasting impact on the share price, where people say, well, people are going to, for a long time after that, kind of say, well, the growth is not guaranteed. Look, there was a moment when X happened. It's probably the biggest short-term risk. The biggest long-term risk, I think, for me is the pace of technology eventually displacing them, just like they displaced whoever was providing services to the people they're selling their services to.
That was one of the most interesting ones that you talked about.
Because I think like people kind of forget the fact that like we do evaluations in 5-10 year increments, sometimes longer, whatever, right? But you kind of think about like do you remember what technology was like 20 years ago? I mean, like, oh my God, like the leaps. And it's kind of easy to think, well, these guys are at the forefront now and they're miles ahead and they're gonna stay miles ahead. Yahoo was miles ahead 20 years ago. Like
now they're Yahoo Finance. I mean, at least that's relevant.
but this is like a really important point. It's like, yeah, they're miles ahead. There's nobody even remotely on the horizon. There might be some small startups trying to disrupt or whatever, but like, hey, completely different. Like, technology has this way where when there is a massive leap in tech, whatever it is, maybe like new generations of processors that make like the way that you structure data and interact with data completely different. Other stuff, which just means you basically have to kind of do a ground up rewrite, even if you are the market leader. And eventually there'll come a time when, I don't know, it could be in 5 years, it could be in 50 years, eventually there will be a time when some new Palantir will come and kill this dinosaur Palantir and make them relatively irrelevant and offer the US government a massive incentive because of what they offer in the product. Right. To switch. It has to be a massive one, but eventually, and overnight you go and lose like most of your business, like it's not going to work out very well for you. Like this will happen.
Right.
The question is when it's going to happen, because it happens to every technology company in history. Like eventually
IBM is the
the
best
technology
example
company
you
will die. Well, the IBM is the most kind of relevant in a way, but it's like technology shifts and changes, and you have like, sure, they have a bunch of really smart people, they have a bunch of extremely sophisticated technology, and they're continuing to innovate to stay ahead of the game. But the time will eventually come. No, even though Palantir is one of my biggest positions, you just need to be like with any company. I think the key is you need to be aware of the risks. You need to be just like knowledgeable. You need to understand that the risks exist rather than negate them. And I always get frustrated when people just when they believe in the company or they invest in a company, or whatever, they're like, they just brush everything. It's just FUD. It's just like, just stop saying this stuff. It's not relevant. I'm like, well, like it's not true. I'm like, well, it is true. Like every investment has downsides.
Yeah.
The first sign that somebody doesn't understand their investments is if they claim there are no downsides.
Right. It's not an investment at that point.